There is a kind of morning that only exists on a farm. The kind where the sky is still purple at the edges, where the air smells of dew and diesel, and the only sound is the creak of a barn door you have opened 10,000 times before. John Whitaker had known that morning his whole life. He knew every fence post on his land because he had set most of them himself. He knew which field flooded first after a hard rain. He knew where his father was buried, under the big oak tree near the south field, and he visited that grave every Sunday. John Whitaker was alive, deeply, undeniably, unmistakably alive. So when he walked into his local bank on a Tuesday morning to renew a routine lien on his tractor, and the teller behind the counter looked at his ID, looked at her screen, and then looked back at him with the face of someone who had just seen a ghost, he assumed it was a mistake. She turned the monitor toward him slowly, his name, his date of birth, and beside it, a date of death, 14 months ago. A death certificate filed and notarized. His 200 acres of family farmland listed as estate property, already in the process of being transferred to someone else. John walked out of that bank on legs that barely felt like his own. He sat in his truck for 11 minutes. He did not cry, he did not scream. He just kept repeating the same 4 words to himself quietly, like a man making a vow. Who did this to me? Not a question, a promise. The Holloway Funeral Home had stood on Oak Street since 1962. Chester Holloway, third generation, was a quiet, dignified man who had buried half the county. He was not the kind of man who rattled easily. But when John Whitaker walked through his front door that afternoon, Chester went pale the moment he recognized him. Because Chester Holloway had a file with John Whitaker's name on it, a real physical file. Inside it were funeral arrangements, prepaid, fully documented, a burial plot in the county cemetery, Section D, Row 7, and a casket not ordered, not reserved, delivered. Someone had not just forged John Whitaker's death certificate, they had staged an entire death. They had selected a plot, arranged a casket, and paid for everything in cash. Chester said a woman had handled it, a professional, composed, carrying proper documentation with a county seal. She had given her name as Patricia Vance. She had listed herself as the executor of John Whitaker's estate. John knew that name. Everyone in Harlan County knew that name. But before he could follow that thread, he needed to understand the full shape of what had been taken from him and exactly how. When John drove back out to his property that evening, he found orange surveying stakes hammered into his fields. Dozens of them spaced every 30 feet, running in straight lines across land his father had first broken ground on in 1971. Nailed to his fence post was a legal notice from Webb Development, LLC. Marcus Webb was 38 years old, drove a black Mercedes, and had spent the past decade turning farmland into subdivisions across Harlan County. His company had acquired over 4,000 acres in the region. Some of it was bought fairly. Some of it, as John was beginning to understand, was bought through methods that had nothing to do with fairness. The notice stated plainly that the property had been transferred through a legally filed estate settlement. Any occupants were required to vacate within 30 days. 30 days to leave the land where his family had farmed for over 50 years, the land where his father was buried. John stood in that field for a long time. The wind moved through the wheat stubble. A hawk turned lazy circles overhead. Then he folded the notice, put it in his shirt pocket, and called a lawyer named Daniel Prout, a young man with a small office above the hardware store, no fancy reputation, and a hunger to do something that mattered. John Whitaker drove to the city the next morning. Alone, against his lawyer's advice. Marcus Webb's office was on the 14th floor, glass walls, river views, the kind of space designed to remind visitors of exactly who held the power in the room. When Webb came out and saw John standing in his lobby, a man his record said had been dead for 14 months, something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like a chess player recalculating after an unexpected move. Webb was smooth. He expressed shock and dismay. He insisted his acquisition team had followed every legal procedure, that if there had been any fraud, it was not on his end. He offered to pause the development timeline out of courtesy while things were sorted out. He said all the right things. But when John asked him directly, "Who brought you the deed?" Marcus Webb went quiet. His answer, when it finally came, was carefully bureaucratic. "Our acquisition team handles those details." It was the answer of a man who knew more than he was saying and had decided exactly how much to reveal. John drove back to Harlan County understanding something he hadn't when he arrived. Marcus Webb was not just a buyer who had been deceived. He was part of the machinery, and the machinery went deeper than one land deal. Daniel Prout spent 3 days in the county recorder's office, pulling every deed transfer and estate filing from the past 11 years. He was no longer just building John's case. He was looking for a pattern, And he found one. 6 properties in Harlan County had transferred through estate settlements following the sudden deaths of their owners. 4 of those owners were genuinely deceased, but 2 of them were not. The first was John Whitaker. The second was a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher named Earl Denton, who had farmed 80 acres in the northeast corner of the county for 40 years and had no idea that, according to official county records, he had died of a cardiac event 18 months ago. Daniel found Earl through a church directory. He showed up at his front door on a Thursday morning. Earl answered in his bathrobe holding a cup of coffee. He listened to everything Daniel said without interrupting. His face stayed still the whole time, the face of a man who had seen hard things and learned not to react before he understood them. When Daniel finished, Earl set down his coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the fields he had been locked out of for 18 months, the barn where he had raised 4 children, the land he had planned to leave to his grandchildren. "So someone killed me on paper," he said, "and took my land." He paused. "Son, I've been dead for 18 months. I got nothing left to lose. I'm in." Patricia Vance had been the Harlan County Register of Deeds for 16 years. She had worked under 3 county commissioners. She had processed tens of thousands of property transfers. She was at every church picnic, every school board meeting. She baked casseroles for sick neighbors and had received the County Service Award twice. She was, by every measure anyone had ever applied, the most trustworthy woman in Harlan County. She was also, according to the evidence Daniel and John were assembling, the person who had designed and executed the entire scheme. Her position gave her something no outside criminal could ever buy: complete, legitimate access to every property record in the county. She knew which farmers were aging, which ones had no close heirs, which parcels sat on natural gas deposits or in the path of coming development. She could identify a target, assess its value, and initiate the process with nothing more than a phone call and a forged signature. Working through a network of complicit notaries and a county coroner named Gerald Sims, who had since quietly retired to Florida, she would arrange a fake death certificate, complete with proper county seals and notarization. The estate would be managed through a shell company she controlled. The land would transfer, Marcus Webb would buy it, and Patricia Vance would collect an untraceable commission, her hands appearing clean throughout. 4 operations, 4 stolen farms, and she had been preparing for more. What she did not know was that somewhere in a barn in the South Field, inside a steel filing cabinet that had belonged to Harold Whitaker, there was an envelope that had been waiting 34 years to be opened. Harold Whitaker had been a quiet man. Not a suspicious man, a careful one. He watched, he remembered. And back in 1991, something had disturbed him enough to write it all down. A neighboring farmer named Will Ketterly had been declared dead and his property transferred with unusual speed. Harold had seen Will Ketterly at the feed store just 3 weeks before the death certificate was filed. He had noted the names on the transfer documents. He had taken a photograph on a disposable camera developed at the pharmacy of Patricia Vance, leaving the recorder's office with Gerald Sims the week after Ketterly's death. He had saved receipts from the estate auction. He had written notes, dates, names, prices that did not add up. He had put everything into a manila envelope, sealed it with tape, and written 4 words on the outside: "If something happens to the farm." Then he had tucked it beneath the bottom drawer of a steel filing cabinet in the corner of his barn office, and told no one. Harold died of a stroke in 2019. John had kept the cabinet but never sorted through it fully. Until the night after he found the surveying stakes in his field. At the bottom of the envelope, beneath the photos and the receipts and the handwritten notes, was a single piece of paper in his father's careful, slightly slanted handwriting. It said, "I cannot prove any of this yet, but I know what I saw. Patricia Vance is connected to the Ketterly transfer. Gerald Sims signed the death certificate. Something is wrong in this county. If this ever happens to our land, start here." John sat on the floor of that barn office for a long time, holding a warning his father had written 34 years ago, for a moment exactly like this one. Daniel Prout presented the full case to the state attorney general's office on a rainy Wednesday morning in November. 2 living men declared legally dead. Harold Whitaker's 34-year-old documentation. Financial records connecting Patricia Vance's personal accounts to 6 property transfers. Cell records placing Vance and Sims together in the weeks before each death certificate was filed. And a handwritten ledger found during a search of Vance's home office listing future targets, future farms, future deaths that had not yet happened. John Whitaker's name was on that ledger, so was Earl Denton's. There were 4 more names beneath theirs. Patricia Vance was arrested on a Tuesday morning, the same kind of quiet, unremarkable Tuesday on which John had walked into his bank 16 months earlier and been told he did not exist. She was arrested at her desk in the county recorder's office, surrounded by 16 years of files she had used as a weapon. Gerald Sims was extradited from Florida and cooperated fully. He named 3 notaries and a clerk in the county office. And he confirmed what the financial records already suggested. Marcus Webb had known enough. Not everything, but enough to understand that cheap deeds sometimes come at someone else's expense. Webb Development was fined for $2 million. Marcus Webb pleaded to a lesser charge and served 8 months. Patricia Vance was convicted on 12 counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 19 years. The land was returned, all of it, to all of them. John Whitaker drove back out to his farm on a cold December morning and pulled every orange surveying stake out of his field. By hand, one by one. He told me later that he did not feel triumphant. He felt tired and grateful and deeply sad for his father, who had spent 34 years carrying a secret he never got to see resolved. But he also told me that he goes to his father's grave every Sunday now, under the big oak tree near the south field. He tells him what is growing, how the cattle are doing, what the weather has been like, and every time before he leaves he says the same thing. I found the envelope, Dad. I read your note. We won. The land does not lie. It does not care about forged documents or county seals or shell corporations. It remembers who turned it, who fed it, who buried their people in it. John Whitaker knew that. Harold Whitaker knew that. Earl Denton knew that. And in the end, so did a judge, a jury, and the state of Harlan County. If this story moved you, if you believe that land is legacy, and legacy is worth protecting, hit that like button. Leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you. And subscribe to Acre Stories, because every week I bring you a new story, a real story, about real people who refused to let go of what was theirs, and refused to stay dead.